In this video, I'm going to be breaking down and explaining every single graphics option for PCSX2, but more importantly, showing you what they actually look like with side-by-side examples. So by the end of the video, you'll know what you're setting, why you're setting it, and if you should be setting it in the first place. Since the last video, I've learned a lot more about this emulator, and as a result, a bunch of advice has changed. We're also going much more in depth with everything, but in particular anti-aliasing, which is where most people tend to go wrong with PCSX2. Also, thanks to the harassment from yours truly, we now have a new option to play around with. Gamma adjustment was absolutely needed, and of course, I'm going to tell you all about it when we hit post-processing. So let's just get into it. So we're going to start at the top with graphics renderers. And out of all of these, there is a clear winner. And that is most definitely Vulkan. It's accurate and it performs the best. But you may not have the hardware to be able to run this one, in which case you can use OpenGL or Direct3D 11 instead. OpenGL is the most accurate hardware renderer you can use, but it may not perform the best. Whereas Direct3D 11 is the most inaccurate one you can use, but its performance is pretty good. So with these two, it's just a case of pick your poison. Now software, of course, is not a hardware renderer because all rendering is taking place via your CPU in software. And for reasons, it makes it the most accurate option you can use. So if emulation accuracy and keeping the image true to the original is your main concern, software renderer is the one for you. Do keep in mind when you select it, you lose access to the majority of the rendering options because there's no hardware acceleration, essentially locking you to everything the PlayStation 2 originally used. But you can still use the display options with it to make it look appropriate for a digital display. Null at the bottom is for debugging only and doesn't even display an image, so just ignore this one. Now I fully recommend you go with Vulkan by default if you got it, but if you're unsure, just go with automatic. With adapter, actually select your main GPU so you're not leaving anything to chance. So we're going to move on to the rendering options instead of the display stuff because it makes more sense to. Now increasing the internal resolution will cram in all of those additional pixels for whichever resolution you set. As always, when upscaling, it's recommended to set this to your screen resolution, as going beyond it is for the most part overkill. There is a misconception that setting this beyond your screen resolution on its own is going to apply anti-aliasing. However, this is just not the case. So if you take a look at the bottom of this box, at 1080 we've got a bunch of jaggies. And even if I set this all the way to 8K, as you can see, those jaggies remain. We are adding those additional pixels, but no proper anti-aliasing, and I'll be covering proper AA once we hit that section, so for the moment, keep this to your screen resolution. Now to save on the PS2's resources back in the day, most 3D textures were made like this. Then the PS2's bilinear hardware filtering was applied to smooth everything out and remove the blockiness. However, not all textures got filtering. Quite often 2D textures, or even entire 2D games, didn't have any filtering applied at all. And ultimately, it was the game devs that chose which textures got filtering and which ones did not. But with this option, we can override what they've done and decide what gets filtering ourselves. So bilinear PS2 is the default and it's applying exactly what the devs applied. You want to keep it as the default as it doesn't break anything. Now setting nearest isn't using any filtering and shows these textures au naturel. There isn't really any reason to use this with 3D games as it reveals the blockiness. However, if you want razor sharp pixels in pure 2D games that are using bilinear, this may be an option to remove it, if it doesn't break any rendering. Now setting bilinear forced would apply it to all textures, including the ones the devs didn't apply it to. This comes in handy if you want to smooth out 2D assets and games that don't have any filtering whatsoever. But again, watch out it doesn't break anything. The exclude sprite variant of this does exactly the same thing, only it won't apply it to the 2D sprites. But the tricky thing is, what you think is a sprite sometimes isn't, and vice versa. So if you want bilinear for all the 3D stuff, but none of the 2D stuff, this may or may not exclude all the sprites and 2D content you want it to. So just keep an eye out. And again, this can break rendering. Now some games also utilize trilinear filtering, which is essentially using bitmaps to calculate smoothing gradients to textures that are going to be viewed at extreme angles. For example, this track in Jak X Combat Racing. This allowed devs to apply smoothing to the textures that are in the distance and have them become sharper the closer they get to the point of perspective, with a smooth gradient between the two, which in turn creates a depth of field effect. At the time, with CRTs, this was the pinnacle, but on digital displays, especially at high resolutions, it can look quite blurry. But with this trilinear filtering option, we can turn it off, which as you can see significantly sharpens all those textures, as we're removing trilinear filtering entirely only leaving the bilinear underneath. Of course, we're getting rid of that depth of field effect and emulation accuracy, so it definitely comes down to personal preference if you want to keep it in or get rid of it. But do keep in mind, getting rid of it can break stuff. Now, it is pretty tricky to identify if your game is using trilinear filtering. So a pro tip is to turn bilinear filtering off entirely with nearest, and if you notice any texture blurring whatsoever, you know that it's only due to trilinear. And if I turn trilinear off at the same time as bilinear, as you can see, we are now just looking at raw textures. Forcing trilinear applies it to every texture and replaces any bilinear texture filtering. For most games that only use bilinear, it's hard to tell the difference with trilinear instead, especially the games that don't even have bitmaps in the first place, to which there are a few and this is all but useless for. However, where this is useful is for games that have already had trilinear implemented, just not as well as it could have been because of the PS2's hardware limitations. And a really good example of this is Burnout 3. As you can see, the smoothing gradients are not consistent. You can see the line where the devs have set trilinear to end, and we've got sharp patches in the distance where there really shouldn't be. And the reason they didn't apply trilinear to the entire road texture is because of those hardware limitations, pushing them to use it sparingly in the way that you see here. But because this is emulation, we are not restricted by the PS2's performance, so we can just go ahead and force trilinear to every single texture in the way they couldn't. And as you can see, we now have much more consistent gradients that arguably look better than the original. And looking at this, the penny should drop as to what it actually does. You for sure want to leave both of these at default and only change them if you feel the need to, which to be honest, I generally don't. Only if I'm super focused on a game will I see if anything else looks any better. But for the most part, using what the dev set doesn't break anything, easiest to use and looks the best. Now, anisotropic filtering with most emulators and PC games is used to make textures look sharper when they're being viewed at extreme angles. But with PCSX2, that is not its main function. With this emulator, it's mostly used to get rid of texture aliasing at extreme viewing angles, which does help with anti-aliasing as a whole. And the nice thing with this is not that performance costly, so times 16 should be okay for the majority. Dithering is mostly an old school technique intended for CRTs. It applies a dithering pattern to textures that helps smooth over color banding and gradients. One downside to this on digital displays though, the dithering pattern is actually visible, and it would have normally been hidden by the scan lines and mask of a CRT. But with this option, we got two ways to get rid of it and two ways to display it. So scaled will scale the dithering along with your internal resolution. So those tiny squares increase in size as you up the internal res. With this one, you can see the dithering pattern the most. Unscaled displays those squares at their native resolution, irrespective of your internal res. In other words, they stay the same size as you increase your resolution. This is best if you're upscaling and retaining the dithering, as those squares will be smaller and harder to see as you increase your resolution, but still doing their job of removing the color banding. Now, turning this off disables dithering entirely, which does remove the pattern, but it does also reveal the color banding dithering is actively removing. Then we have 32-bit, which removes the dithering pattern and the banding, getting the best of both worlds. However, it can break stuff, mainly shadows. So where this is really the best for digital displays, you need to try it per game to see if it breaks anything. My recommendation is to leave it on unscaled by default and try 32-bit per game. But if 32-bit doesn't work, you can just use off, if you're okay trading the dithering pattern for color banding instead. Do keep in mind, not all games even have dithering in the first place, and for those games, you want to keep it on unscaled. Now we can move on to blending accuracy. So some games shader blending needs a bit more power to render certain textures accurately. By default, this is set to basic as it's kinder on performance. But if you launch a game that requires a higher setting, it will tell you exactly what it needs on boot, but it won't change it for you. The higher the setting, the more demanding it is. If you're on really good hardware, you can set this to full or maximum to save you the job having to change it per game all the time. But if you're on lower end hardware, set it to basic and only change it when prompted. If you can't run the game at full speed with the recommended setting, you need to drop it back or find performance elsewhere. So moving on to the display options, and full screen mode is nice and easy, just leave it on borderless full screen. With the aspect ratios, I need to cover 4:3 and widescreen separately. So auto standard will set 4:3 if the emulator detects an interlaced image, but if it detects a progressive scan image, it will automatically apply the slightly wider 3:2. Standard 4:3 will simply set 4:3 irrespective of the image type it detects, and you want to use this if those 3:2 progressive games come out slightly too wide. With widescreen, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can just stretch the image using fit to window, but to be honest, this looks horrific. Instead, it's much better to present a proper anamorphic image, meaning all that extra stuff is actually being rendered in on the sides. The best way to do this is just to play a game that natively supports widescreen. The PS2 came out just before we transitioned to 16:9 as standard, and there may be more native widescreen games out there than you initially thought, and I'll put a link for a list of these in the description below. Just remember to set 16:9 here, then go into the actual in-game options and set 16:9 there. For games that don't natively support widescreen, you can check to see if it's got a widescreen patch instead, which is essentially hacking widescreen. And to check this, all you need to do is find a game in the games list, right click on it and go into properties. Then go into patches on the left hand side, and if it's got one, you should see it plain as day. There's two different ways that you can turn this on. Per game right here in the properties. Alternatively, if you wanted to apply them automatically to every game that's got one and turn them on, you can apply widescreen patches here rather than having to do it per game. Again, don't forget to set 16:9 when using widescreen patches. Now you can force FMVs only into any aspect ratio that you want, but the only reason I tend to use this is when I'm using widescreen, because when you're using widescreen, 9 times out of 10 the FMVs are going to be stretched, and I prefer these in 4:3 or whatever's correct for the game. Now the vast majority of PS2 games use interlacing. This was another old school technique mostly intended for CRTs. It uses two separate fields of lines and alternates between the two really fast to present the image, which is what causes this to happen on digital displays. But we can get rid of these lines in 3 different ways. Firstly, there are games that natively support progressive scan, and I'll put a link for a list of these in the description below. Just remember to set progressive scan in their actual in-game options if it's not active by default. If a game doesn't natively support progressive, you can check to see if it's got a no interlacing patch instead, which is hacking/forcing progressive into the game. So right click on your game in the games list, go into properties, then go into patches on the left hand side, and if it's got one, you should see it. And just like the widescreen patches, you can either turn them on per game right here. Alternatively, if you want to turn them on automatically for all games that have them, you can apply no interlacing patches in the main options, which I fully recommend that you do if you're using a digital display. Now there are still loads of games that don't have native progressive support or a no interlacing patch, and for those we can use this deinterlacing option, which is using one of these algorithms to merge those interlacing lines. Automatic is definitely the best one to use by default, as for the most part the emulator knows which one is best, but you may find a game where auto doesn't quite do the job, in which case you'll need to try one of the others. Sometimes at high resolutions, no deinterlacing can work the best if auto doesn't. But a pro tip, you can press F5 with the game actually running to cycle through these, making it really easy to find the one that removes the lines the best. If you've cycled your way through these and still can't get rid of those lines, activate disable interlace offset and go through them again, and hopefully you should find a winner. Now this bilinear filtering option is not to be confused with bilinear texture filtering. Of course this has only been applied to the textures, whereas this is being applied to the entire image on output. This is used to slightly refine the image to make it look a little bit nicer for digital displays. You can notice this more at lower resolutions because at higher ones its effects are much more subtle. So none of course isn't using any filtering, and it will give you the sharpest possible image. For myself I'll set this for pure 2D games for razor sharp pixels. For 3D games I'll always use bilinear smooth because it's removing those harsh edges off of those pixels, which does go some way to helping with anti-aliasing. Yes, it is slightly softening the image, but that in my opinion is actually a benefit, and for some games this needs to be set, otherwise you're going to see the texture blockiness underneath. Bilinear sharp is kind of an outlier here, and you want to use it if you want something between none and smooth. Vertical stretch comes in handy when you're using widescreen, because sometimes the image can turn out a little bit vertically stretched or squashed, and obviously with this option you can fix that. Another weird CRT thing the PS2 used to do was intentional blurring. This looked just fine on CRTs, but on digital displays again it looks absolutely horrific. Not all games used it, but for the ones that do, we've got 2 ways to remove it. The first and best way is with game patches. So again, right click on your game, go into properties, then go into patches, and if it's got one you should see it. Now unlike the interlacing and widescreen patches, there is no way to automatically turn these on, so you can only do it per game. This anti-blur option is completely separate to patches, so don't think it's going to turn them on in any way, shape or form. This is simply deploying the emulator's internal solution. This is on by default out of the box as it doesn't really break anything, and you can keep it on by default even if you're using a per game patch. Generally using patches is better than this option, but it has come on leaps and bounds recently to the point where you might not even find yourself reaching for a patch. Integer scaling will scale the image in integers, which is technically more accurate, but it can reduce the viewport size. So personally, I tend to stay away from it, and it's really one for the OCD math nerds. Screen offsets is way too complicated to get into, so to keep it simple, if you see this kind of issue, you need to turn it on. To show the overscan area, screen offsets also needs to be active, but I think that pretty much every single PS2 game just has black bars in the overscan area, meaning there's no practical reason to display it, so just keep it off by default. Now we can move on to post-processing and proper anti-aliasing. There's two different ways to do it, both pretty nuanced, and we're going to start with FXAA. Now FXAA is an often bashed form of anti-aliasing. However, its effectiveness is only ever as good as its implementation, and with PCSX2 it's actually pretty good. However, its effectiveness can drop off at higher resolutions, which tends to be around about the 4K mark. So 4K and above, it is going to take an effect, but you're still going to have a few jaggies remaining. The other way to apply anti-aliasing is to use one of these downsampling shaders at the bottom here. And inversely, these work better at high resolutions than they do lower ones. So if I select this 4G RGSS1 at 1080, it is doing a good job, but it's not completely removing the jaggies. However, if I increase my internal resolution all the way up to 4K, as you can see, it's doing a much better job. And the higher you set your internal resolution with downsampling, the more anti-aliasing will be applied. So at 12x, it pretty much completely removes all of the jaggies entirely. So realistically, it's FXAA up to about 4x, and 4K and up, you should be using downsampling. But there's nothing to say that you can't use both at the same time for even more anti-aliasing, irrespective of your internal resolution. So recently, I submitted a request to the PCSX2 GitHub to add gamma control to Shade Boost, as it was definitely needed. And not only did they take me up on my suggestion, they had it done in no time. So thanks to the PCSX2 team for taking this one on. Now Shade Boost as a whole is here to adjust monitor settings without actually adjusting your physical monitor. This is needed thanks to the variance of analog hardware back in the day, because the game's default brightness, contrast and saturation back then were mostly an estimation by the game devs. Because 10% brightness, for example, with one TV manufacturer may be more akin to 15% brightness with a different manufacturer. Same for contrast and the other settings. So devs would have done the best they can to get it looking correct for everyone, but there is no accounting for analog variance. As a result, some games at default may look just fine, and others are going to look incorrect with their brightness, contrast, etc. The best example of this is Metal Gear Solid 3. As you can see in this scale, everything under the orange line is meant to be black, but we can actually see it, which is why this game looks totally washed out. Now, even though this is telling us to adjust our monitor brightness, it's not really the brightness we need to adjust because of the differences between analog and digital hardware. Simply lowering the brightness doesn't really get rid of those gradients, and at the point it does, it is just way too dark. So instead, we need to adjust the contrast, gamma, and brightness in conjunction to get the result that we want. For this game in particular, the first thing I'll do is increase the contrast up to 56, which as you can see gets rid of those two bottom gradients, which is what the devs intended. An increase in the contrast specifically is what is going to remove that washed out, foggy, hazy kind of thing that you can get with a lot of PS2 games. However, by increasing the contrast, we've made the midtones darker and the highlights brighter to the point where they're blowing out and losing detail. And before gamma control, the only way to fix either of these was with brightness. The downside to this though is that if you were to decrease this so those highlights are no longer blown out, those midtones become even darker. And inversely, if you were to increase it so those midtones are actually correct, those highlights become even more blown out, meaning you had to find a compromise. And this is the entire reason I requested gamma control. Because gamma, in layman's terms, will only adjust the midtones. Think of it as you're only adjusting the darker stuff in the image, allowing us to increase the brightness in those darker midtone areas without blowing out the stuff that's already bright. Effectively giving us control over the midtones and the highlights independently, meaning we don't have to compromise. So with MGS3, we can get rid of the washed out look by increasing the contrast, and with the blown out highlights, we can fix those by decreasing the brightness down to 46. And with the midtones that are too low, we can increase those with gamma up to 57. Now it kind of goes without saying that what you need to set here is going to vary game to game. And beyond getting it correct in the brightness calibration, it also comes down to personal preference, especially when it comes to saturation, which for this game, I do like to bump up to 52. So here's the before and here's the after. Much better, which is why Shade Boost is so important and shouldn't be ignored. But for the most part, I recommend that you keep it off and only change it if you notice a game looks completely washed out or incorrect with its brightness and contrast. Now, contrast adaptive sharpening will add additional sharpening to the entire image. And for the most part, I recommend you sharpen and resize for the display resolution. And you can choose how sharp you make it on the right hand side. And this is another one you're going to notice more at lower resolutions than you are at higher ones. And as you can see, if I crank this up at 1080 all the way to 100%, it's revealing the texture blockiness underneath, and it's also revealing those sharp texture edges. However, something I came across completely by chance is that if you use one of the downsampling shaders with it, it completely mitigates those issues. So we get to enjoy 100% sharpness without any of the downsides. Again, this is one you want to keep off by default and only set it up per game, as how it looks is completely dependent on the game's graphics, and you don't really want to be using this with just pure 2D games. Now we've been through all the graphics options, I do just want to quickly cover latency control and frame pacing in the emulation options. Now VSync you'll need to activate to get rid of the screen tearing, which is pretty much guaranteed to happen, especially at higher resolutions. PCSX2's frame pacing straight out of the box is actually really good. So activating optimal frame pacing isn't really going to have too much of an impact on your actual frame pacing. However, what it does do is reduce your input latency, which is one of the major complaints with this emulator. But using this is hugely costly on your performance, so make sure that you got the headroom to be able to use it. Now PS2 games natively run just slightly slower than 60Hz, and if you're using a 60Hz monitor, that difference can cause micro stutter. But sync to host refresh rate is here to fix that issue. It allows the emulation speed to run over by up to 1%, which will bridge the gap between the two, which should remove that micro stutter. When it comes to setting your defaults, of course, just set it up to your preference. But if you want to copy what I do, here's what I've got set for my display, rendering, and post-processing tabs. But I set all of this up in the knowledge I'm going to be changing a lot of it per game. And don't forget you can change everything that we've covered in this video on a per game basis. So with the game actually running, you want to go into settings in the top left hand corner and click on game properties. Then come down to graphics on the left hand side, and as you can see, we have all of those exact same options. And anything that you change here will be done for this game specifically and will not mess around with your global defaults. So hopefully this updated video has answered any questions you might have about these settings. And if it didn't, let me know in the comments below and I'll do my best to help you out. But if it did help you out, slam it a like. And if you want to keep up to date with any future guides, you know what to do. And if you want to help out with the channel, check out the Patreon link in the description below. And apart from that, go play some games. Adios.